So when Doug asked me last week whether I would come and talk to MRAS, it's sort of like I want to talk a little bit about where I've been, and since I started the business in 1991, because it's a long time. I've had a chance to watch, the political development, industry development, and participate in that in Minnesota. And so the first thing I had to do when I started the business, I had gone through engineering school and material science. I went into material science in the 80s thinking that solar thermal was what I was going to work with, because that's what we were doing in the early 80s. And in material science, you're looking at materials development, and there was just all this stuff hitting the literature about photovoltaic materials. And I got really excited about photovoltaics. And I knew when I graduated, I either had to go to grad school and get deep into the research in developing new technology and pushing it along, or get out there and start hawking it and get it on roofs. And that's what I chose to do. My wife was horrified because she had did a good job as a nurse, put me through engineering school. Well, I helped. I worked when I could, But it was like selling the cow for 3 magic beans. So the first thing I do was say, okay, how do I define my success? Because that's what I'm going to be working with. That's the vision, right? So I had some choices to make. You can't do all of those, especially when you decide to go into solar in Minnesota where there's no market in 1990. So wealth, that was out. I didn't think there was much glory in it, although thanks for the applause. Security, well, in the long term, yes. Mastery, I guess I had a shot at, feeling like I was a master of, the technology and could work with it. And a sense of belonging, my peeps are the solar community by and large. And of course, I wanted to help save the planet. And so I had to define success. I wrote a nice little thing about it, and it got buried under a pile of things. And my wife I found it and showed it to my wife about 10 years later, and she cried. Because she said, the way you've defined success for yourself, you've done it. I just had another idea. I mean, she just thought it was going to be one of the other things. Little thing, And at that point, she quit her job and joined the business. This was 2000. And then we were both up at 1 o'clock in the morning worrying about how we were going to make payroll the next Friday. So she went back to nursing. I was really glad. So she's my partner in crime. I just need to acknowledge that. So my career path was, for a long time, finding work for myself. And then after 10 years of trying to do that, I found I needed a couple of helpers. And so it's sort of like the rungs on the ladder. Then, it's like it was obvious to me that I wasn't keeping up with the sales leads. And so I really needed to have somebody who could focus on that. That was all they were doing. Because, you let a lead go cold and they've gone somewhere else. They decided to buy a new car with the money they were going to spend on solar or whatever they were going to do. So, and now, of course, they can hire a competitor. Back then, they didn't have that option. So I sort of felt kind of like, well, if they're going to buy, they're going to buy from me. Well, but then they went and bought the new car. So, based on our ability to market and sell, then I was able to build a full-service organization. And at that point in time, I was also involved. I joined MRAS in 1990 when I started the business. And we watched it dwindle down to, there were about 4 of us in 1997 or 8, and we were sitting around a kitchen table going, okay, are we going to lay this down now, or are we going to keep going? And we looked around and said, well, are you in? Are you in? I'm in. And so we kept going. And actually, we were then, after another year or two, we had an organizational development consultant come in, and he was able to spend 45 minutes with us because he was heading off to the Republic of Georgia to help farmers organize, their a cooperative marketing effort. So he was a big world player. And in those 45 minutes, he sort of sized us up and said, the first thing you guys ought to do is hire a volunteer coordinator, because you got a bunch of people in your mailing list and your phone tree And so, I had the idea that, we never made good on that, and we always did other things. And then I realized, wait a minute now, I recruited Doug. And that was what we needed. Unfortunately, he was a volunteer, and I just didn't think that counted, that we needed to be paying somebody to do that. But Doug has been, helping to build the volunteer base and utilize the volunteer base forever now, it seems like. So thank you, Doug. Doug, I was honored to present Doug with the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Mencia convention last fall. So I was involved in, helping to get Mencia over a hump. MRES over a hump, and then I left the board to help form Mencia, the trade organization, the Solar Energy Industry Association chapter here in Minnesota. And so building industry organizations, great, and I've got other people building the business. So now welcoming others into the industry. And I have a real testimony about welcoming people of color into the industry. So I formed a crew this last 2 years of Black and Latino workers. And so we're going to be installing the system at Shiloh Temple up on Broadway as soon as Cooperative Energy Futures gets the funding inked, which we're that close. I hope it happens before December because, it's like, well, actually you'll see. I'm just going to skip along ahead here because I know I'm a little late. So I'd say one of the things at DIMIC and solar, I'm just going to harp on a couple of my issues. Okay, and this is true in my business as well as, I've just seen elsewhere, that a person succeeds in doing the work and then they get promoted to management. And this is a construction thing. And with little or no training, they fail because what happens when there's too much going on is most people get quiet. They put their head down and they're just going to go harder. They're going to work, and maybe they're not going to put all that on their timesheet, and then they have a nervous breakdown or something, or they just cut corners. So you have this problem. And what I just like to put out there every time I talk about solar is we need good management. So what I'm doing right now is building a management culture. Have a sales and management team. Now we're building the construction management team. But I just think that we're still a little shy on the management. So it could be better organized. So I'm just going to say that's part of what okay, so now I'm going to just, I didn't put these in any order. Well, I kind of did. What I'm going to show you, this is sort of a trip down memory lane for me, and then I'll kind of get to more current stuff. But we did a lot of stuff out in the country. So here's a windmill and a photovoltaic array. This guy was let's say communications, what was it, like the cell phone and the .com. He was a .com millionaire. So this was a very expensive system on a farmhouse that he bought down in Pepin, Wisconsin, with a little 1 kilowatt Berge battery charger and a photovoltaic array, probably Kyocera modules. And typically we were working with trace inverters, which I don't know how many of you are familiar with trace inverters. I mean, they were the inverter, really, the main inverter to work with in the 90s.
Could you point to the different parts of the system?
Oh, love to. Okay, so these are two trace inverters, 4 kilowatt, 48 volt. So the battery box here, and so we have this is the DC, I guess isolation switches, which then your basically photovoltaic array, your wind, and your connection to the inverter.
Well, you got a laser pointer on there.
Oh yeah, right. Okay, let's see how that works. Okay, I just have to hold my hand steady. So the inverters and the connection between the PV coming in and this is the utility connection here. And so we were utility interactive, but these inverters needed batteries. So my background is battery type systems, for 10 years. Before the German inverters came on the market. So this sort of feels, with the new interest in solar plus storage, it feels like we've come around full circle. and I'm delighted to be part of that. So I'll go back, and this was Ascension Technologies was a company out of Massachusetts. You see this little sticker here? You know what that is?
Inspection?
That's the inspector's sticker. He signed off on it. And we went around the barn about 10 times with this because there's a lot of parts in there. So, and it's not all UL listed. And so what I had to do was, this was like it was my first time through this particular issue, which is that if it's not UL listed, the electrical inspector won't sign off on it. And so I basically had to hire an engineer to wet stamp, an approval letter that said, I've reviewed all this and it hangs together and you can go ahead and sign off on it, Mr. Inspector. So that's what this represents, is sort of path breaking. Nobody's ever, in Minnesota probably tried to, put this past an inspector. It's a spaghetti junction, right? It's got a lot going on. An inspector looks at that, their eyes glaze over, they look for the UL and they don't see it, and they say, where's the door?
What's a UL?
Underwriters Labs.
Oh, Underwriters Lab.
So it's either, it has to be a national testing lab that works, with the IEEE standards, typically 1547, which governs a lot of battery and solar standards. And UL, what they're doing, and ETL and so forth, they're testing labs that basically set up tests that will create conditions where you test what up to the standard and just make sure that it does what the standard requires. So anyways, this is that's probably enough in the weeds there. But I don't know, you guys were talking about some pretty intricate stuff when I came in the room, so I guess I don't need to hold back on that, do I? Okay, so this is the inside of the MRA solar power trailer, which I was really proud of. I had a lot of fun because we had a Berge 1 kilowatt wind turbine that attached to the batteries down here where you can't see, and then we had the PV system on the roof, and then we had the outlets where you plug all your loads in, and so this was a lot of fun, and pretty early on in the game. I mean, in 1997, I think, was when we built it, and so it's been, and it was at the state fair this year, so it stood the test of time. That's 20 years. How much do they warranty solar PV modules for? 25 years, right? So it has lived up. Although it's probably on its second or third generation of solar or PV modules, right?
Yeah.
Largely because the ones that I put on there first were Unis Solar, and they were like 12% efficient, and the ones on there now are, there's probably half again as much power generation. So, and this is installing a solar thermal system on the roof of the Wedge Co-op, which we started out thinking we were just going to be doing photovoltaics because of material science. I just had that in my head. But we were getting all these calls from people who wanted thermal, or who had systems from back in the 80s or 70s who hey, there's nobody out here anymore who's going to do anything to keep my system running. What do I do? So we kind of looked at each other and said, it's a lot messier, but somebody's got to do it. I mean, you get that gunk all over you when you're filling the system up, the glycol, and it's plumbing, and there are leaks that you have to fix. And it's just messy. It's not like that nice clean wiring, So this is Mia Devine and Mario Monasterio putting together the racking for this solar thermal array that was going to heat hot water for the bakery that they had just set up down in the first floor of the Wedge. And you notice that they're working with Unistrut. There was no such thing as these nice extruded rails that you can just wrench together real quick. You gotta cut, fit, stand in the store and figure out what it is how you're going to build your rack, and make sure you didn't forget any parts so you don't do 20 trips to the hardware store, just 10. But they were okay. So enough about that. I'm just sort of okay. So there are some things that I would have to say that when I was looking through my photos over the last 3 or 4 days to find stuff, and that I could actually show that might have some story that's useful. The one at the Science Museum, now we had just started working with Unis Solar. And Unis Solar, had this material that they made into shingles which I thought was a great idea because, 2 for 1. You got shingles and then you got photovoltaic module all in one. Boy, was that a bummer to work with, though. I mean, there were things that, again, the UL listing really didn't cover how we had to do things, and so we had to run it by the inspector and all that. But so they came up with this roll, peel, and stick that when they built the science house behind the Science Museum, and I think Chris Berta was involved in, conceptualizing this project. You notice these areas where there's no roofing. I mean, where we didn't put any of that stuff on there. It's because, it just comes in these lengths and you got to work with that. You can't cut it. It's like cutting a solar panel. So we thought maybe the first 10 that we installed of these Unis Solar systems would be like pole barns, a nice big rectangle. Little did we know the first one was going to be a castle. So with a tower and an outbuilding, and it's all got to hang together. So that was a lot of fun. And what this, I guess the story, a lot of detail work and a lot of figuring out. So when you've got to go run a plumbing stack, but you have, a panel you can't cut, what do you do? Well, and so Unis Solar, they said, we'll sell you real cheap some dummy laminate. We never saw dummy laminate. So what I ended up having to do was buy a couple rolls of real PV and just cut them up and use them for all those little places there where we needed to just fill out and make it look nice and professional. Yeah, it kind of added a little bit to the cost. But path breaking, yes. I loved the product, it just fit right in between standing seam metal roof. So a lot of our projects, and then so this was one of the first projects we did, 2001, I think, or early 2002, where the German inverters that were straight grid connect, no batteries, had come on the market. And so these are the inverters for that array that were pushing power just directly into the building electrical system, and that's just standard practice now. But this was one of our first attempts to do that. So we probably had a few too many switches. We probably could have done away because there's some stuff in the inside there that was kind of redundant, but we didn't know. So kind of a close up of, and we had to do. They made a laminate that had a bottom potting that came out the bottom, and so we came into the soffit, and then when it went out the top, so we came into the wall there, and you can kind of see the patching that we had to do, and so we did that all the way across. Anyways, probably too much detail. This was my first employee, Sean Young. You might know Annie Young, who was still on the Minneapolis Park Board.
To go back to the previous photo, how did that system connect into the inverter?
Into the grid?
Yeah.
Well, you saw the inverters, so we had to run the wiring, up, in the roof basically, and then down on the inside of the building.
Where did wires hook up on it?
They come out the bottom because you don't want to have something that's going to catch snow and get stepped on or like mess with. So it just comes out the back of the roll here. So as you roll it out, we had to have a hole that we had to position that wire so it went right down in the hole and have a little ring that sort of a bushing, so it didn't. And there were a couple where we didn't put the bushings and where it slid a little bit and the wire got kind of like it cut into the insulation. And so we had a good time troubleshooting this and repositioning these things. So
does it run right through the roof or just underneath the...
It goes down into the soffit.
Right into the soffit.
Yeah, and then through the soffit, then into, like typical wiring, just through the wall and so forth. Until it gets to the side of the building where the inverters are. So Sean Young. And this is Dean Zimmerperson, who was one of the first Green Party members to sit on Minneapolis City Council. Subsequently was framed and went to jail. But he was doing clean, honest work here. That was my crew. And so we're putting these things down, and with the shingles, we had to put this. I could have done a dozen photos of this, and I just did one. But you had to go through into this track that's the only thing that was UL listed to take the wires that came out the back of the shingle. And so we had these rows of holes where it had to go exactly through the hole into this track, and then make all the connections in this plastic conduit stuff on the underside of the roof decking. Very exacting, but, well, I guess maybe I didn't have, okay, so I didn't put any of the other photos. So one of the things that, we did a lot of, back then was setting up this windmill and the solar power trailer, and then putting a booth up. And this was the first Living Green Expo. It was like in 2002, I think, 2003. There was sleet coming down, and nobody came outside. This was very disappointing. It was a great exercise putting this all together and getting set up, but nobody came outside. So, so here we are with a booth at the MRA Fair over in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. And we were one of the first vendors to start showing stuff there, putting a booth. So we have the solar power trailer kind of in back there. You can kind of see the modules. But MRA was very good to us. We got good crowds at the MRA. So we did a lot of those kind of things. We did a lot of work on farms. I mean, you saw the farmhouse. This guy was a pilot for American Airlines. Lived in way far northwest Illinois, like up by Rockford. He was a Minnesota boy. He grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota. But so he was a farmer, and he had like 8 kids. And this is next to his runway because he was a pilot for American Airlines. What he did for his bread labor was flew jumbo jets to Europe and back. And so he'd be 2 or 3 days flying and then 2 or 3 days off. It was perfect for his farming because then he'd go cultivate the crops and all that. And we were there for a week putting 3 pole-mounted solar array up. And I remember walking behind him as he drove this trencher. I thought, God, here's like a jumbo jet pilot driving this trencher. It's like he seems so at ease on this trencher because there's only like a dozen controls rather than 100. But they fed us for a week with food grown on the farm. And the only thing that they fed us that was not grown on the farm was breakfast for 2 days that was like breakfast cereal. Everything they grew on the farm. I couldn't believe it. So we were doing projects that were really kooky like that. And we had to go far afield. I've never done another project in Illinois. And here are 2 of his kids, filling trenches.
So what year was that?
Like 2002. So the early years. Okay, and my last message, this is the Green Institute. This is where Doug and I connected. Because Doug was real excited about putting up the largest PV system in Minnesota at the time, 34 kilowatts. Yep. And of course it was winter. People ask me, what kind of seasonality do you experience in your business? And I call it the money season. When the cash flows, we get work. And when the cash doesn't flow, we don't. And if the cash doesn't flow in July, we don't work in July. And when it flows in December, we work in December. And so there are all these photos as I was going through stuff where we're working like in snow. And I'm thinking, man, like most of our work back then was during the winter, just because of the way the money flowed. So here we are with our cart, putting, just trundling stuff around. I think there were like 800 modules that we installed on this, and they were really low wattage. I mean, now you would take 150 to do that much, if that. I think there were 43 watts.
Have they replaced them?
Yeah. Actually, Wellington Management bought the building because Green Institute went out of business, and so they took, and that actually had storage. It had batteries. Daryl Thayer actually set that part of it up. We had the largest outback installation in the country, like 13 charge controllers feeding the batteries, and then a dozen inverters, pushing the power out. And it matched very well with the loads of the they had a geothermal heating system, heating and cooling. And so the most energy that, or the most power that the geothermal system will draw typically is on a winter morning. When you want your nighttime temperature to go up to your daytime temperature, and you got to take those BTUs in 60-degree water, and you got to slam them together and get like 120-degree, air coming out of a vent, and so that's when the refrigeration system runs. In the summer, 60 degrees, you just run it through a heat exchanger, and you don't have to run a refrigerator because 60 degrees feels mighty cool, when it's 85. So here we're putting a solar thermal system up for Horst Regelbacher, who built the Aveda Corporation. And I'd say this is one of my learning experiences where I had an engineer that I just hired, who shall remain nameless, who had no negotiating skills, up against a very temperamental and headstrong artist with way too much money. And Horst won. And so this is to heat the drive, it's to melt snow on the driveway. Now, if you look at the angle here, this is a great summer and spring and fall angle for these, but it's lousy for the middle of the winter. We should have been up at like 65 degrees or 70. That's when we really needed it. And so, but he had Oprah coming to stay in a cabin down the drive, and so he didn't want the top to show over the top of the peak of the roof. So that drove the whole design. So this was another learning experience for a business owner like me. Don't let your engineer negotiate with a temperamental artist with too much money. So we did a lot of repair work on old systems that were installed in the 70s and early 80s. So this is one where, again, we're doing it in snow because that's when the cash flow. Okay, I'm going to fast forward now to what are we doing now? We've gotten very good at working with the program, so the Made in Minnesota program and all that. But then commercial industrial, now that the state legislature has set the cap for net metering at a megawatt, that's 1,000 kilowatts, rather than 40 kilowatts, which is what it was from 1981 until 2013. The Public Utilities Commission, by the way, is still processing on the docket. I don't think the tariffs for any of the investor-owned utilities in Minnesota have actually been approved yet for up to a megawatt for net metering. So this is 500 kilowatts, and this is a steel plant, a steel fabrication plant. And one of the things I really love about Leo Lewis, this is Lewis Industries in Paynesville, Minnesota, is that he didn't do this just so he could have some solar electricity. He did this because he really wanted to understand, by being down in the weeds, how the solar industry works, because he intended to actually make racking for PV mounting. And so Game Change is one of the brands, I think they're based in New York. So he basically is the Midwestern manufacturer of Game Change racking, which a lot of the community solar gardens have used because it's a local, so there's not much shipping cost, and I guess the price point is right. About half, I've been in the plant in the last couple months, and about half of the warehouse, which is what this bottom half is, the south half, is Game Change stuff that's either piles of sheet metal that are coming in or racking parts that are going out. So that's he's succeeded in not only getting solar power for, and I probably makes about 2/3. The real roughly about 2/3 of his power consumption. He's pretty efficient. He uses laser cutters and he buys these. He's just always upgrading, getting the most efficient German laser cutters that he can, with his budget. So pretty efficient. About 2/3 of the power comes from, and this is 10K solar. Anybody heard of 10K solar? Been in the buzz, for the last couple of years. As a matter of fact, they were down in Bloomington here, and unfortunately went out of business because they sold their souls to Wall Street. It was what's the name of that big investment firm? Goldman Sachs that bought 10K. So in order to get the operating capital that they wanted, they sold to Goldman Sachs, And they had a couple bad quarters, and Goldman Sachs just said, now, if they'd been independently owned, I just think that you got to think about who you're getting your capital from. And, okay, anything else to say about this? Well, so what we did was we hired a technician from 10K Solar, who basically, it's his full-time job, because we have, well, going around to all our sites, of which we have probably 75. A lot of them are 40 kilowatt systems that we sold through Made in Minnesota, that program that just got killed by the legislature. Thank goodness, because now we can move on to other programs that are better designed. So it's his full-time job. It's sort of like these systems, instead of just being a Chevy that just chugs along, and you change the plugs every 2 years and change the tires and keep the oil. It's like having a really fancy sports car. And every 2 weeks, you got to have it up on blocks, have mechanics, working on it, keep that nice sports car running. I mean, it performs about to 80% of what was predicted. And that's because of the inverter bus problem that 10K ran into. And so I'm probably one of the most exposed contractors with 10K equipment, because we probably have like 75 systems. Not this size, most of them are 40, and then some residential. But so what I'm doing here in this slideshow is sort of showing you the challenges that I've run into. And so this is a big challenge. Also, we had never done a big commercial industrial system like this size. And so when I looked at the flow chart at Xcel Energy of the decision tree about getting from when you first make your application for interconnection to when you get approved, it sort of looks like you can bounce through it in, maybe 3 months. And 8 months into it, our customer went ballistic, and he and my salesman called the Star Tribune, and they published a scathing article. And I got a call from Xcel Energy's president, the CEO of NSP, the next day, like, "What the hell you guys doing?" And, "Well, hey, we got your attention." So we negotiated that instead of having an engineer, see, an engineer, now I know that I have an engineering background. I know there are a number of engineers here in the audience, but an engineer's top 2 priorities are the technology, you got to get it right. Well, no, that's it. The manager's job is timeline and budget, right? The money and the time. The engineer isn't responsible for that. So in Xcel, when you put the engineers responsible for all 3 aspects of a program, you're asking for a bad PR situation. And so we kind of called it out, and they agreed that they would actually have a manager take our projects of this size and have the manager kind of like scheduling when the meetings with the engineers were going to be and how long it was going to take, for a turnaround on a drawing, things like that. So that was good, and we didn't get into far in the bad graces of our customer. It was mostly Xcel, although he sort of thought I wasn't being proactive enough. But it's like dealing with the IRS. What means proactive, Kimosabi? We called, "Hey, let's tweet Donald Trump and have him," or something. Well, we don't know because it's so big, right? So, although I find that Xcel Energy is one of the best utilities to work with. So, I'm going to end with this photo of it's a 5 megawatts. So here's 500 kilowatts, and here's 10 times the size, 5,000 kilowatts. So this is our Red Wing Community Solar Garden. So I would say that when the Community Solar Garden Law was enacted in 2013, because I was on the board of MNCEA, I was like, well, okay, there's a lot of stuff that's got to get worked out, so I don't want my company to jump in and be the first one and be on the bleeding edge and make all kinds of mistakes and all that. Well, little did I know that my salesmen, however, were licking their chops because they're going, "Wow, we can do 5 megawatts, and we can sell subscriptions for like 20% of that. 5 subscriptions. If you actually sold, I think, 250 residential systems, how much time and energy would that take as opposed to selling 5 subscriptions to a community solar garden, my salesman will not, do the populist thing. And I can't really expect them to, unless I'm going to do it. But they're the ones that have the job of selling, right? So they're going to sell subscriptions to community solar gardens. I am happy about this because it moves away from net metering, which I think net metering is really on the way out, and that we're at a point where we've built an industry on net metering, where the utility buys power for the same price that you buy it for, so it goes through the meter that, both sides. Well, if you look at the economics as you go from like 0.1% market penetration of solar to 10%, I know that's a big jump, but the economics for the utility just don't work anymore. I mean, you can't buy it for the same price you're going to sell it. They generate it for 2 cents a kilowatt hour, with wind farms now. Well, maybe 2.5, but very low. And then they sell it for 10 cents retail or 6.5 to a commercial customer. So this actually is a little bit different, but now they've been paying, 12 cents a kilowatt hour for that bill credit. So the economics is even worse, but I think value of solar, which they've moved to this year, where you basically have the itemized list of benefits, some to society, some to the utility directly. Actually, now that's the tariff under which they're doing this. What I want to say is that storage is the next big thing, and I know I'll probably find out the hard way about it, some great ways to not do storage, but I think that storage is, when you combine it with solar, is going to be a good way to model a better working relationship with the between the non-utility players and the utility players. I just think that one thing that we've overlooked since net metering was enacted so long ago is that it's still a regulated monopoly in this state. Not like Pennsylvania, where they have retail, you can buy from any one of 20-some different retail suppliers because they've deregulated the market there. Well, here, it's still a regulated monopoly. In the utility service territory, they're the ones that are the balancing authority, for instance. They have to balance on an instantaneous basis, the load and the generation. If the generation gets much higher than the load, you let the factory smoke out of a lot of equipment. If the load gets higher than the generation, you have brownout. You still let the factory smoke out. So it's a real balancing act. I don't want anybody else to have that job but the utility. And so I want to reframe the issue that it's not that the utilities hate solar, it's that they hate losing control. And that's a different issue. So we can say that if they like solar, now it's a matter of how do we work together so that they get to maintain control over the things that they should. And that's, I think, going to be a much more productive conversation. And storage is what gets into that, because if you think about, I don't know, I've been going to some of the conferences out in California where you have some 13, there's a chart that has 13 different benefits to the utility grid that you can use storage for frequency regulation, voltage regulation, moving the solar to where the real peaks are, like in the evening, rather than the peak demand with air conditioning when people come home from work. It's maybe 2 to 7, so it's after the daily peak of sun. So with storage, you can move that to where it's needed, time-wise. So, however, in general, in order to access a lot of the monetizable values and make it financeable, it's a three-legged race where basically the developer and the customer have to sort of put one foot in the bag with the utility and do this three-legged race in order to have access to the wholesale market and then other retail markets, so that you can get enough monetizable values that then you can go to your financing and get a decent return for the capital supplier. So I just would put that out there, that and if we had more time, if I'd gotten here at 6, I was planning to spend 15 minutes talking about that issue, about control. How do we, so I'll just put that out there for people to think about. How do we talk about control issue with the utilities as the non-utility players, so that we can develop a better working relationship? And maybe storage and solar is the way to do that, because storage actually cleans up, so solar, now you can put it where it's needed in the day, rather than just having to use it when it comes in. Yeah.
Even that picture shows shade over your solar garden.
Mm-hmm.
It's a cloud.
No, this is the trees.
Yeah, but the
Yeah, so, right.
It's dark.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do microgrids fit into your little scenario?
Well, microgrids are, I was just down at OETI having a meeting and where we were talking about microgrids. It's basically a set of loads and generation storage, some combination, which are possible to disconnect from the main power grid. So that's why it's called a microgrid. So I'm more interested in installing what are called distributed energy resources, which are not microgrids. It's just something that is on the power grid, and I want to sell it, or I want my financer to be able to sell it and make a decent, profit, so that they're willing to buy it and to put the capital in.
I know one time I ran into you years ago, and you were saying you were going to focus on banks, on financing, and trying to get banks to understand the value of solar and to basically finance solar.
Yeah.
You did it.
Well, actually, our main finance partner is a big, it's the deregulated side of Washington Gas out in D.C. Ironically, I used to envy the Focus on Energy program in Wisconsin because Washington Gas was buying renewable energy credits from the Eastern Wisconsin utilities, and that's what basically funded the Focus on Energy program. This is in the let's say the aughts up until maybe 2012, and I always envied them because it seemed like they had so much going on over there in Wisconsin, and we were sort of like hard scrabble farmers, kicking the rocks out of the field yet, and not really getting much traction. Well, then Washington Gas made a strategic decision to stop buying RECs and start owning systems. And so we happened to meet at the first NCEA conference, New Energy Equity, who was brokering those deals for Washington Gas, and we made a deal, and Washington Gas has been buying projects in Minnesota now because of the great Made in Minnesota program and the community solar gardens. So Wisconsin's losses are gained because of Washington Gas's strategic decision. So that's one of those sort of behind-the-scenes things that you wouldn't know. So why has Wisconsin faltered? People might blame it on their governor. It had nothing to do with their governor. It had everything to do with Washington Gas making a strategic decision about how they were going to invest. Instead of buying RECs, buy systems.
By racks, are you saying?
Oh, renewable energy credits.
Oh, renewable energy credits.
Yeah. Yeah, you have a question.
Where do you see installations going in the next 3 years, and how is things like collapse of Maine and Minnesota affecting the market?
In the next 3 years?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
On this chart.
up until,
Yes.
yeah, well, and
Yes.
this is the impact of the community solar gardens right here. And what this creates is a labor shortage in Minnesota. So a lot of the developers are importing labor, whether it's project managers who are more seasoned from other states or electricians. So the IBEW has kind of kicked in and said, "Oh my God, none of our contractors is getting any of these jobs." Well, of course, they've priced themselves out, so they've basically figured out a formula to cut that. So now we're actually, because I'm a union signatory, we're actually able to hire union contractors here who have, very well-trained electricians. And so they're the ones who are installing our gardens. So I have a very high priority on using Minnesota labor when possible and building and welcoming people of color into that labor force. So however we can do that, we have to know how the labor market works. And of course, as true believers in solar, that's not the game that we were studying. So now I'm kind of learning about that.
But the number of installations, do you see it going down radically?
Oh, your question, I think that because it's dropped down, our finance partners figured out how to make it work at 1 megawatt when it went down from 5 megawatts to 1 megawatt. And the value of solar, they figured out how to make it work with the value of solar, which is about 10 cents now instead of 11 or 12. So it's a little bit more lean, but because we've we've honed our game over, well, really over this year and this year when we were sort of building up to doing it and then implementing. And right now, I'm more interested in developing the DER market, which is distributed energy resources, and that basically also, if you look at solar and storage and other technologies that are part of grid modernization, the way the California utilities are doing it is they provide the platform, the wires and the IT that allows the grid to perform more like an electric circuit where everything knows what everything else is doing. And you got some very sophisticated controls, and that's what OATI here in Minnesota actually is good at. They sell that stuff to the utility industry in California and Massachusetts and Hawaii now. So they're really gung-ho to sell it here. That's why we're meeting with them. So the IT and the wires provides the platform. See, the essential question is, you've got utilities, the traditional way that utilities raise capital and spend it and then see their return, right? And it's the way that they spend their capital that their return is based on. It's one of those sort of Neanderthal kind of things that we wish would, get updated. But they can do that pretty much if they build a platform for the non-utility players like the solar industry, the storage industry, and really the demand response is probably provided more by the big energy efficiency players, who do guaranteed energy savings, like industry and Johnson Controls. So the non-utility players put the pieces on that platform because it's riskier. You've got more risks being the one that's installing these things. The platform itself is more like the power grid, except it's a really much more sophisticated power grid, where you've got, instead of just dumb wires that power flows one way, you've got smart wires and smart controls that allow everything to know what's going on. And then so that balancing authority that the utilities, I think that they should maintain, and that should be their role. They keep doing that balancing of loads. But now you got a lot of little pieces, a lot of little photovoltaic systems, generating power, and big photovoltaic systems, and storage devices that are storing power and then dumping it in at certain times. And so we're gonna need to have tariffs that actually reward. And then you've got the electric cars. So as the electric car market, heats up, you got people coming home from work at 5 o'clock, oh, I'm gonna plug my car in. Well, not if 100,000 people do that. You're not gonna do that. The utility is gonna have to have pricing that says, you do that, you're paying 25 cents a kilowatt hour. You do it at 10 o'clock at night, and you're paying 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Deal? Okay. So that's what we're gonna see, is that tariffs are gonna change. So that's going to sort of direct the market. And I think that actually is going to be an underpinning that replaces net metering as the foundation for building the market. And I don't know quite what the utility programs are going to look like, but I think the utility, the people that deal with the regulators, the lobbyists, the people I talk to, they all agree that customers want access to the technology now. I mean, it's a very disruptive technology in that, when they were just doing nuke plants and coal plants and even gas plants, nobody wants to, have that in their backyard. But with solar panels where you can put 3 kilowatts on your garage, oh, hey, give me that. So I think that they recognize, all the utilities recognize that there is a demand for that customers want options, they want access. And so there will be programs that give them that. But I think if we want to do 50 times more solar, 49 times what we're doing now is going to be bulk solar, the way the California utilities are doing it. And it's going to be cornfields. I was really opposed to rooftop solar. Not rooftop. I was opposed to ground mount solar. And I wanted the industry to stick to rooftop solar until I realized that cornfields mine the soil. What do? It's industrial agriculture, right? It's feedstock for industry. It's not food for the table. And we're dumping, chemicals, probably petroleum-based chemicals into the soil, mining that out of the soil. And if if you put solar panels there and then plant the pollinator mix, you're building soil the way it's happened for the last 20,000 years. It's the roots of all those plants. So actually, I'm wild about putting solar panels in. Put them in all the cornfields. My humble opinion. Yeah.
There are some installations where they're raising them up high enough to put cattle underneath them as well, so that you can graze those areas too.
Yeah. That has to be, really nuanced, because I know that people have put goats under them, and goats will somehow get up to where they can chew the wires. But cattle aren't like that. I think cattle, they keep their heads down and
But
pay
I
attention to what's on
think
the
the
ground.
installation I had seen, they put them up at 8 feet height.
Mhm.
So there was.
And so they're not going to get, their hides cut by sharp edges and whatnot. Okay, I should probably, I see Doug giving me the high sign here, so thank you very much for letting me to get almost an hour.
Yeah, thank you.